Welcome to my channel.
The sea fret had rolled in off the loch during the night, wrapping the village of Lockdub in a thick, frosty fog that silenced the gulls and chilled the bone. The mountains surrounding the village were entirely swallowed by the grey mist, giving the illusion that the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. To Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, it was a perfect morning to do absolutely nothing. Hamish sat at the kitchen table of the small police station, his long, lanky legs stretched out toward the comforting heat of the stove. His flaming red hair stuck up at odd angles, his uniform tunic was unapologetically unbuttoned, and his hands were curled lovingly around a mug of coffee so strong it could have dissolved a spoon. In the hallway, the telephone began to ring with an urgent, shrill demand. Hamish didn't blink. He just took another sip of his coffee. His dog, Lugs, gave a low whine and twitched one ragged ear toward the noise. "Leave it, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his Highland drawl soft and soothing. "It's only Blair in Strathbane, wanting to know if I've arrested anyone for breathing too loud. Hell tire himself out eventually." The phone rang 8 more times before giving up. Hamish sighed in contentment. Work successfully avoided. However, his peace was short-lived. The heavy, sputtering engine of the early morning bus from Strathbane echoed down the waterfront, its headlights cutting 2 weak yellow cones through the dense fog. It wheezed to a halt outside the general store. Hamish ambled to the window, peering out through the condensation. It was rare for the early bus to bring anything but the mail and an occasional crate of root vegetables. Today, however, it deposited an anomaly. A man stepped onto the damp pavement, wearing a violently yellow puffer jacket that practically glowed in the gloom. He was barking into a smartphone, holding it high in the air as if trying to physically snatch a signal from the Scottish atmosphere. "I don't care what the time is in London, Rupert. I am in some backward, freezing mud hut of a village, and I expect the contracts will be drafted by noon." The man's voice was a loud, braying English tenor that cut through the peaceful morning like a chainsaw. He threw his phone into a pocket and returned to the bus driver. "Is there no porter in this godforsaken place? I have 3 bags in the hold, and I am certainly not dragging them through the muck to the hotel." Hamish watched with mild, lazy interest. The newcomer clearly a Sassenach with more money than Manassois, entirely oblivious to the formidable figure of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, who was emerging from the fog carrying a basket of scones. "You there!" the man snapped, waving a hand at her. "Be a good woman and find someone to fetch my luggage at the Tommel Castle Hotel. Tell them Reginald Fotheringham has arrived." Mrs. Wellington stopped dead. She drew herself up to her full, terrifying height, her tweed coat acting like armor. "I beg your pardon?" "Luggage," Reginald repeated slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Heavy bags. Need carrying. If you have the breath to shout, Mr. Fotheringham, you have the strength to carry your own burdens, Mrs. Wellington said icily. "We do not breed servants in Lockdub. Furthermore, the hotel is a mile up a steep hill, and the fog is thick. I suggest you start walking before you freeze, though judging by your jacket, you are dressed for a Caribbean rescue operation rather than a Highland morning." She marched past him, leaving him sputtering in indignation. From the safety of his window, Hamish took another sip of his coffee and shook his head. Reginald Fotheringham was loud, arrogant, and had just made an enemy of the most formidable gossip in the village within 3 minutes of arriving. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said softly, turning away from the window as Fotheringham began to drag an oversized suitcase over the cobblestones, cursing with every step. "There goes our quiet week." Hamish knew from bitter experience that when people like Fotheringham brought their loud voices and impatient demands to Lockdub, trouble usually followed. And trouble meant paperwork. Hamish truly hated paperwork. Hamish managed to stretch his peaceful morning for another hour, savouring the bitter dregs of his coffee and contemplating the empty state of his refrigerator. The fog outside had thickened, turning Lockdub into a ghostly silhouette. He was debating whether he could brazenly mooch a plate of scrambled eggs from the Patel family down at the local shop when the heavy wooden door of the police station burst open. The brass bell clattered violently, making Lugs jump and let out a sharp bark. In the doorway stood Mr. Shenstone, the perpetually anxious manager of the Tommel Castle Hotel. His usually immaculate tweed suit looked entirely rumpled, and his face was the colour of old porridge. He was gasping for air, clutching his chest as if he had run the entire mile down the steep hill, which, judging by his muddied brogues, he had. Hamish did not get up from his chair. He merely raised one ginger eyebrow and let out a tragic sigh. His chance at a free breakfast had vanished. "Is there a fire, Mr. Shenstone?" Hamish asked mildly, his voice a slow drawl designed to calm hysterics. "Or have you simply forgotten how to use the telephone? Dead, mister," Shenstone wheezed, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "It's that terrible man from London. Loud, who got on the bus early. He's out by the kitchen gardens. He's completely dead, Macbeth." Hamish closed his eyes for a brief moment, mourning his ruined day. A murder in Lockstub meant endless paperwork, the invasion of heavy-booted forensics teams, and, worst of all, the inevitable arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane. Hamish slowly pushed himself up from the table, buttoning his tunic with agonizing reluctance. "Well, he can't be slightly dead. Now can he?" Hamish muttered. He grabbed his peaked cap, which sat askew on his untidy red hair, and whistled for Lugs. "Lead the way, Mr. Shenstone." The walk up to the Tummel Castle Hotel was a steep, miserable slog through the biting dampness. The fog clung to the heather and muted the crunch of their boots on the gravel drive. Hamish shambled along, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, looking for all the world like a man sleepwalking. Yet, beneath his drooping eyelids, his hazel eyes missed absolutely nothing. He noted the undisturbed frost on the main path. They rounded the side of the grand, turreted building, entering the sheltered enclave of the hotel's sprawling kitchen gardens. There, amidst the frosty cabbages and the tangled, dormant vines of winter squash, lay Reginald Fotheringham. It was an undeniably bizarre and somewhat humiliating final posture. The loud Englishman was tipped upside down, his head and shoulders entirely submerged inside a massive wooden rain barrel that the kitchen staff used for watering the herbs. His legs, clad in expensive tailored trousers, dangled awkwardly in the air. The violently yellow puffer jacket he had been wearing earlier was bunched up around his waist, making him look like a tragic, overgrown canary that had missed its landing. "I found him like this, Mr." Shenstone stammered, wringing his hands. "I came out to check the frost covers. I haven't touched him." Hamish stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He did not pull the man out. It was blatantly obvious that Fotheringham was beyond help, and pulling him from the barrel would only ruin the scene before the photographers arrived. Luggs sniffed at the base of the barrel and gave a soft whimper. "Good boy," Hamish murmured, scratching the dog behind the ear. He crouched down, his lanky frame folding like a deck chair, and began to study the ground. He appeared lazy, a simple village bobby out of his depth, but his mind was racing with cold, sharp logic. The mud around the barrel was churned up, but only in a small radius. Fotheringham had not been dragged here, he had walked. Furthermore, Hamish noticed a glaring discrepancy. The man was wearing only one expensive Italian leather loafer. His right foot, clad in a patterned silk sock, was entirely bare. Hamish scanned the cabbage patch, but there was no sign of the missing shoe. A man did not simply hop to his death in a freezing garden. Someone had been with him, someone who had perhaps caught him off guard. Did he check into his room? Hamish asked softly, still fixed on the solitary loafer. "Yes," Shenstone replied, shivering. Caused a dreadful fuss, then stormed out back, yelling into his mobile phone again. Hamish sighed heavily, the cold mist swirling around him. The piece of Lockstub was shattered, and he was going to have to do some actual work. Hamish remained crouched beside the frozen cabbage patch, shielded from the biting wind by the sturdy stone wall. The frosty fog was stubbornly refusing to lift, instead curling thick and heavy around the yellow puffer jacket of Reginald Fotheringham like icy smoke. Luggs sat patiently by his master's muddy boots, offering a low, anxious whine. Hamish stroked the dog's coarse head, his hazel eyes fixed on the solitary loafer, waiting for the circus to begin. He did not wait long. The blare of police sirens shattered the quiet, a harsh wail making Mr. Shenstone cover his ears. Two marked vans and a standard-issue Rover careened wildly up the gravel driveway, their tires tearing up the stone chips. The doors flew open, and a swarm of uniforms spilled into the freezing mist. Leading the charge, like a wrathful, overfed bull, was Detective Chief Inspector Blair. His heavy face was a spectacular shade of mottled purple, a dangerous combination of the biting chill and his permanent state of simmering rage. He wore a rumpled trench coat stretching precariously across his substantial middle, chewing aggressively on an unlit cigar. He stomped through the vegetables, crushing a row of winter kale beneath his heavy brogues. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing the hotel turrets. "What in the name of all that is holy have you done now? Cannot I have one peaceful weekend without you dragging me out to this edge of nowhere?" Hamish rose slowly, unfolding his long legs and deliberately projecting complete vacuity. He touched his peaked cap in a lazy salute. "Morning, sir. I didn't do a thing. It was Mr. Shenstone, who found him taking a permanent dip in the rain barrel. Blair snorted, glaring at the upended corpse. He marched up to the barrel, his heavy breathing pluming in the frigid air, entirely oblivious to the subtle churn of the mud around the base. Jimmy Anderson, Blair's long-suffering sergeant, trailed behind him, looking thoroughly hungover. "Well, it is obvious, is it not?" Blair sneered, waving a hand at the body. "The man is a tourist. An obnoxious English tourist, by the look of that ridiculous jacket. Probably got roaring drunk, wandered out here to relieve himself, tripped and drowned. Accidental death. Case closed. We can all go home and get a cup of tea." Hamish let his mouth hang open slightly, adopting the expression of a dim-witted village idiot. "Aye, sir, that might be it," he drawled slowly, scratching the back of his neck. "Except for the fact that he arrived on the early bus not an hour ago, completely sober, and he seems to have lost his right shoe before deciding to dive headfirst into the freezing water." Blair stopped chewing his cigar and snapped his gaze down to Fotheringham's mismatched feet. His purple complexion darkened further. He hated when the local bobby pointed out details he had missed. "Do not try to be clever with me, you long streak of misery," Blair bellowed, stepping aggressively into Hamish's personal space. "The shoe probably fell off when he was thrashing about. Or a fox took it. What do you know about proper police work? You are nothing but a glorified traffic warden who spends his days poaching salmon and hiding from real work. Get out of my crime scene before your sheer stupidity contaminates the evidence." "As you say, sir," Hamish replied, his voice painfully polite and entirely devoid of inflection. "Shall I go and cordon off the main road, then?" "Do whatever you want, as long as it is nowhere near me." Blair barked, turning his back to shout orders at the forensics team. "Anderson, get a photographer over here, and someone will fish this idiot out of the barrel." Hamish did not need to be told twice. He whistled for Lugs, who trotted faithfully at his heels as he ambled away. As he left the garden, the village idiot's mask slipped off. His eyes sharpened, his mind piecing together the timeline. Fotheringham had insulted Mrs. Wellington, stormed off to his room, and then marched outside. Someone had followed him, someone who wanted him silenced quickly. Hamish shoved his hands deep into his pockets, deciding his first port of call would not be the main road to direct traffic, but the warm kitchen of the local postmistress. The formal police could have the freezing mud. Hamish was going to find the missing shoe and quietly solve the murder before Blair could ruin everything entirely. Hamish ambled down the steep, winding road from the Tommel Castle Hotel, leaving the cacophony of DCI Blairs shouting behind him. The fog was finally beginning to thin, tearing into wispy grey ribbons that revealed patches of the steel-coloured lock below. It was a biting, bitter cold, the kind that seeped right through a police tunic and settled deep in the bones. Lugs trotted faithfully at his side, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. Rather than following Blair's barking orders to stand pointlessly at the main road, Hamish steered his long, lazy strides toward the heart of the village. He was specifically targeting the warm, yeasty aroma wafting from the local bakery and post office combined. The bell above the door of the post office jingled a cheerful counterpoint to the grim morning. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of baking bread and strong, dark tea. Behind the counter stood Mrs. McLean, a small, bird-like woman with eyes that missed absolutely nothing in Lochdub. She was currently organising a stack of local newspapers, but her attention immediately snapped to Hamish as he ducked his tall frame through the doorway. Hamish offered her a slow, sleepy smile, pulling off his peaked cap and running a hand through his untidy, flaming red hair. "Morning to you, Mrs. McLean," Hamish drawled, his voice a soothing Highland murmur. "It is a fair old freeze today. I do not suppose you have a spare cup of that tea going begging, and perhaps one of those fine cheese scones to keep the chill out of a poor policeman's bones." Mrs. McLean tutted loudly, though her eyes gleamed with eager anticipation. She already knew something was afoot. News travelled faster in Lochdub than light. "You are a terrible mooch, Hamish Macbeth," she scolded lightly, reaching under the counter for a thick ceramic mug. "But you look half-starved, as usual. Sit yourself down by the radiator. I suppose you will be wanting to talk about the grand commotion up at the hotel. 4 police vans went tearing past my window not 20 minutes ago." Hamish sank gratefully into the rickety wooden chair beside the hissing radiator, stretching his long legs out. He took the steaming mug and the warm scone she offered, sighing in pure contentment. "Aye, it is a terrible business," he murmured between bites. "That loud Englishman who came off the early bus. Found him taking a swim in the kitchen garden rain barrel. Dead as a doornail." Mrs. McLean gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, though she leaned closer over the counter. "Lord preserve us!" The one in the terrible yellow coat? Mrs. Wellington was just in here buying stamps, completely vibrating with rage. She said he spoke to her like she was a scullery maid, demanded someone carry his bags. Imagine. I do not have to imagine, I saw it, Hamish said mildly, taking a long sip of his tea. He was loud, quite right, shouting into his telephone about contracts and deadlines. Did he mention who he was coming to see? Mrs. McLean narrowed her eyes, lowering her voice as if the jars of boiled sweets might be eavesdropping. Well, he didn't say it to me, but Archie down at the garage mentioned seeing a fancy envelope dropped on the post office floor earlier this week. Return address was a London property development firm, Fotheringham, and it was addressed to old Angus over at the Glebe. Hamish paused mid-chew, his hazel eyes losing their sleepy glaze for a fraction of a second. Old Angus was a stubborn, reclusive farmer holding onto a prime piece of land bordering the loch. He had been struggling with debts for years, but he had sworn to die before selling to outsiders. A London developer arriving in Lochdub, aggressively demanding contracts, and immediately ending up dead in a barrel pointed a rather large, muddy finger at the local farming community. Angus, you say? Hamish mused, adopting his vacant expression once more. That is interesting. I suppose Blair will be kicking down his door soon enough. That heavy-footed menace from Strathbane is here. Mrs. McLean sniffed in disdain. He will terrify the whole village and arrest the wrong man, just like he always does. You mark my words, Hamish. Angus wouldn't drown a man. Head just hit him with a shovel. A fair point, Hamish agreed, finishing his scone and brushing the crumbs from his tunic. But Blair likes an obvious target. An angry farmer in debt fits the bill perfectly. I just wonder why an angry farmer would steal a man's right shoe before drowning him. Hamish thanked Mrs. McLean with a lazy tip of his cap, stepping back out into the biting Highland chill. The fog had thinned to a pale, milky haze, clinging stubbornly to the dark waters of the loch. Lugs fell into step beside him, his tail wagging a slow, rhythmic beat. If DCI Blair was already zeroing in on old Angus at the Glebe, Hamish had very little time to uncover the truth before the farmer was dragged off to Strathbane in handcuffs. But confronting Blair directly was a fool's errand. Instead, Hamish directed his long, ambling strides away from the village centre and up the winding, frost-hardened path that led toward the grand estate of the Halberton Smythes. He needed a different perspective, specifically one that understood the ruthless, sharp-elbowed world of London property developers. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, with her cool blonde elegance and aristocratic background, possessed exactly the sort of cynical insight Hamish required. Plus, the estate kitchen always had exceptional coffee. He found Priscilla in the sprawling glass conservatory attached to the main house, aggressively pruning a towering bougainvillea. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Hamish earned in a month, her blonde hair tied back in a messy knot. She paused, shears in hand, as Hamish tapped on the glass and let himself in, a blast of cold air following him. "Hamish," she said, her voice carrying a clipped, amused affection. "I heard the sirens, and Mrs. Wellington already telephoned my mother to complain about a corpse ruining the hotel's kitchen gardens. I assume you are hiding from Blair?" "I am conducting a highly strategic retreat," Hamish corrected, sinking into a floral-patterned wicker chair. Blair has decided the man drowned himself by accident, despite the fact that someone tipped him upside down into a rain barrel and stole his right shoe. Priscilla set down the pruning shears and wiped her hands on a cloth, her sharp blue eyes narrowing. A London developer named Fotheringham, according to the Village Telegraph. What on earth would a man like that be wandering around the hotel gardens in the freezing fog? "Looking for old Angus, perhaps," Hamish murmured, stretching his legs. "Word is, Fotheringham was trying to buy the Glebe. Angus is drowning in debt, and his land borders the water. Prime real estate. Blair will undoubtedly arrest Angus before lunchtime just to close the case and get back to a warm pub." Priscilla frowned, moving to a side table to pour 2 cups of coffee from a silver-insulated pot. She handed one to Hamish, who took it with a sigh of pure gratitude. "If Fotheringham is from the firm I think he is, they don't send their senior partners to freeze in the Highlands just to bully a single farmer. They send underlings for that. If a man like Reginald Fotheringham came all this way himself, it means the deal was either incredibly lucrative or incredibly illegal." Hamish blew on his coffee, peering at her over the rim of the delicate china cup. "Illegal how?" "Insider knowledge," Priscilla suggested, leaning against the edge of a potting bench. "A new zoning law being passed, perhaps, or a secret plan for a luxury marina that the locals don't know about. But the shoe, Hamish, that's the detail that doesn't fit. Why take a shoe? Unless, she paused, a look of distinct aristocratic distaste crossing her features. Unless it was stolen from the shoe itself. My father uses a bespoke cobbler in Sant. Some of these paranoid city men have false soles built into their footwear to hide memory sticks, vault keys, or sensitive documents they don't trust to the cloud. It's terribly gauche, but they do it. Hamish sat up slightly straighter, the lazy facade dropping completely. The missing loafer wasn't a random act of a scuffle, nor the work of a thieving fox. The killer had deliberately removed it to retrieve whatever Fotheringham had been hiding. That meant the murderer knew Fotheringham intimately, knew his paranoid habits, and knew exactly what he was carrying. This was not the work of a hot-headed local farmer swinging a shovel. "Priscilla," Hamish said softly, setting the exquisite cup down with a clatter. "You are a marvel." "I know," she replied dryly, picking up her shears again. "Try not to let Blair arrest the entire village while you prove it." Hamish whistled for lugs, his mind racing. If the killer had taken the shoe to get a hidden item, they were likely someone from Fotheringham's own World Simeon who had followed him on that early bus, or perhaps someone already staying at the hotel who knew he was coming. As he stepped back out into the biting wind, a heavy police rover tore down the road below, heading straight for the glebe. Blair was making his move. Hamish had to find the real killer's trail, and he had to do it quickly. Hamish left the warmth of the conservatory with his brain buzzing like a disturbed beehive, despite the outward appearance of a man merely wandering home for a nap. Priscilla's suggestion of custom shoes had changed the entire texture of the morning. If Fotheringham's shoe was a vault for secrets, then the killer wasn't some local lad with a grievance, it was someone playing a much higher stakes game. As he descended the winding track, he saw a plume of black exhaust rising from the direction of Old Angus Cottage. Blair was there, no doubt shouting himself hoarse and trampling the poor man's flower beds. Hamish needed to stay out of the DCI's sight, or he'd find himself assigned to guarding the perimeter of a turnip field for the next 12 hours. He detoured through a thicket of gorse, his boots sinking into the peat, and made his way back toward the Tommel Castle Hotel from the rear. He wanted a closer look at the path Fotheringham had taken before he ended up head-first in the cabbage patch. The fog was now little more than a thin veil, and the sun was a pale, heatless disk hanging over the loch. As he approached the hotel's kitchen entrance, he saw the forensics team packing up their kits. Blair's sergeant, Jimmy Anderson, was leaning against a van, looking remarkably like a man who had spent the night in a gutter and was now regretting the dawn. "Jimmy," Hamish called out softly, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry to the garden where Blair's roar could still be heard. "Is the chief still convinced it was the drink that did it for him?" Anderson spat a piece of tobacco onto the gravel and nodded gloomily. "He's got his teeth into that poor farmer, Angus. Found a crumpled letter from the developer in the man's kitchen and decided that was motive enough for a hanging. He's up there now, trying to find a matching shoe in the pigsty." "And did the boys find anything in the pockets of that yellow jacket?" Hamish asked, leaning casually against the van. Anderson shook his head. "Empty. Not even a wallet. Just a set of car keys for a rental parked at the station and a half-eaten roll of peppermint. It's a clean job, Macbeth. Whoever dumped him knew what they were looking for." Hamish nodded, his eyes wandering toward the hotel's staff quarters. A young woman in a maid's uniform was standing by the back door, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. She was staring at the rain barrel with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Hamish didn't approach her directly. He knew that the sight of a uniform, even one as rumpled as his, often silenced the very people who had the most to say. He waited until Anderson had climbed back into the van and the forensics team had rumbled away down the drive. Then he whistled for lugs and walked toward the bins, acting as though he were inspecting the hotel's refuse disposal. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the maid finish her cigarette and turn to go back inside. "Dreadful business for a Tuesday," Hamish remarked to the air, his Highland lilt sounding particularly gentle. The girl froze, her hand on the door handle. She looked at Hamish, then at the friendly, scruffy dog at his heels. "He was shouting," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "In the hallway before he left. I was turning down the beds in room 4. He wasn't on his phone then. He was arguing with someone." Hamish took a slow step closer, keeping his hands visible and his expression one of mild, neighbourly interest. "Someone from the village, was it?" The girl shook her head vigorously. "No, a woman. She was wearing one of those expensive Macs, the kind that look like Thea made of silk. She was telling him he couldn't go through with it, that he was going to ruin everything." "And did you see where she went?" Hamish asked. The girl pointed toward the front of the hotel. She went out the main entrance just as he stormed out the back. "I thought she was a guest, but Mr. Shenstone said she wasn't registered. She must have come on the bus with him." Hamish felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the weather. A woman in an expensive Mac, travelling light, following a developer to a remote village, and disappearing before the body was even cold. It was far from Blair's theory of a drunken accident or a vengeful farmer. As the maid ducked back inside, Hamish looked toward the loch. If there was a mystery woman in Lochdub, she couldn't have gone far without being noticed. In a village this size, a stranger was as conspicuous as a lighthouse. But the red herring Blair was chassing the idea that Angus had done it about to cause a very public and very wrong arrest. Hamish had to find the woman, and he had to find the secret Fotheringham had been carrying, before Blair's pride ruined an innocent man's life. The chill in the air seemed to deepen as Hamish watched the hotel door click shut behind the frightened maid. The woman in the silk mackintosh was the ghost in the machine, a shadow that didn't belong in the rugged woolen reality of Lochdub. If she had arrived on the bus with Fotheringham and hadn't checked into the hotel, she was either remarkably hardy or she was hiding in plain sight. Hamish knew every bed and breakfast, every potting shed, and every draughty attic in the village. A woman dressed for a London boardroom wouldn't be squatting in a barn. He set off down the hotel's rear path, moving with a deceptive, swinging gait that covered ground much faster than it appeared. His destination was the Lochdub Arms, the only other place in the village that offered a semblance of anonymity, though in a place where everyone knew your grandmother's maiden name, anonymity was a relative term. Luggs trotted ahead, his nose twitching as he investigated the frost-covered verges. As they reached the main street, the sound of a raised, familiar voice drifted over the stone walls. DCI Blair was back from the glebe, and he was in a towering temper. Hamish ducked behind a high hedge of rhododendrons just as Blair's Black Rover screeched to a halt outside the police station. The DCI climbed out, his face a vibrant shade of magenta, hauling a bewildered and terrified old Angus by the arm. The farmer was still wearing his muddy Wellingtons and clutching a tattered flat cap. "I don't care if you were feeding the sheep." Blair's roar could have woken the dead in the local kirkyard. "We found the victim's correspondence in your kitchen, and you've got a motive as wide as the Firth of Forth. You're coming to Strathbane for a long, quiet chat, you old goat." Hamish watched from the shadows, his heart sinking. Angus was a stubborn man, but he was as gentle as a day-old lamb. To Blair, however, he was a convenient statistic, a way to wrap up a case before the evening news. Hamish waited until the station door slammed shut behind them, effectively locking the village's only official law enforcement away in a frenzy of misguided bureaucracy. The coast clear, Hamish slipped out from behind the hedge and headed for the Lochdub Arms. The bar was empty this early in the day, save for a few local fishermen nursing halves of heavy and staring gloomily at the fire. Behind the bar was Barney, a man whose eyebrows were so thick they appeared to be two small, furry animals nesting on his forehead. Barney saw Hamish and immediately began pouring a small whiskey without being asked. "You look like you've seen a kelpie, Hamish," Barney grunted, sliding the glass across the polished wood. Hamish took a medicinal sip, feeling the liquid fire slide down his throat. "Not a kelpie, Barney. Just a DCI with the brains of a turnip. Tell me, did a woman come here this morning? Tall, expensive clothes. Looks like she'd catch pneumonia if she stood in a draft for more than 10 seconds. Barney leaned in, his eyebrows knitting together in a single, formidable line. Shiz in the snug. Ordered a gin and tonic at 10 in the morning and hasn't touched a drop of it. Just sits there staring at the wall. Came in off the bus, carrying nothing but a handbag and a look of pure misery. She asked if there was a private way out the back, which I thought was a bit odd for a tourist. Hamish nodded slowly. This was the hidden motive beginning to take shape. It wasn't about land or sheep or the simple greed of a developer. It was about people chasing money. He left his whiskey unfinished rare sacrificand, moved toward the small, wood-panelled room at the back of the pub, known as the Snug. He paused at the heavy velvet curtain, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. Inside, he could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of a finger against a glass. He pulled the curtain aside. The woman was exactly as the maid had described, elegant, brittle, and entirely out of place. Her silk mackintosh was draped over the back of the settlement, and her hands were trembling so violently that the ice in her glass was chiming like a funeral bell. She looked up as Hamish entered, her eyes widening in a mixture of guilt and sheer, exhausting relief. "I suppose you've come to arrest me," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite her shaking hands. Hamish didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, looking every bit the slow-witted Highland policeman. "I haven't even finished my tea yet, mistress," he said softly. But I think you and I should have a talk about Mr. Fotheringham's missing shoe before the men from Strathbane come looking for someone to blame." The woman let out a jagged sob, her composure finally shattering like ice under a hammer. She wasn't the killer, Hamish realized instantly. She was the witness who had been too terrified to speak, and she was holding the key to a motive far darker than a simple property dispute. The woman in the snug reached into her expensive leather handbag with trembling fingers and pulled out a crumpled lace handkerchief, dabbing at eyes that were red-rimmed from the biting Highland wind, and a secret she could no longer carry. Hamish remained standing, his presence a calm, unmoving anchor in the small, dim room. He didn't push her, he knew the value of a well-timed silence. Outside, the distant sound of a tractor engine provided a low hum against the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, she looked up, her gaze fixing on the silver buttons of Hamish's tunic. "I am Penelope Vance," she whispered, her voice brittle. "Reginald's junior partner. Or I was, until he decided that greed was more important than loyalty. He wasn't just here to buy land from a farmer, Constable. He was here to bury a scandal that would have liquidated our entire firm." Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes watchful. "A scandal worth a man's life, then? And I suppose this scandal was tucked away in his right shoe?" Penelope let out a shaky breath, nodding slowly. Reginald was paranoid. He kept a hardware wallet on encrypted drive with the records of every bribe we've paid to planning committees over the last decade. He carried it in a hollowed-out heel. He was going to use it to blackmail the very people who sent him here, to ensure he got a bigger cut of the Lockstub development. I followed him to stop him from being a fool, but I wasn't the only one. Hamish leaned against the doorframe, his mind clicking through the possibilities. The Sassenach tension he had observed earlier wasn't just between the English and the Scots, it was a civil war within the firm itself. "You saw him in the garden," Hamish prompted gently. "I saw him arguing with someone near the rain barrel," she admitted, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "But it wasn't a stranger. It was someone who knew exactly where he kept his leverage. I saw wrestling, splash, and then I ran. I was terrified they'd see me." Hamish straightened up. The pieces were shifting into a new, more dangerous pattern. If Penelope was here, and Fotheringham was dead, the person who had actually tipped the developer into the water was likely still nearby, waiting for the fog of Blair's incompetence to clear before making their escape. "Stay here, Miss Vance," Hamish said, his voice dropping its lazy lilt. "Do not go back to the hotel. For the love of peace, do not talk to the man with the purple face and the loud voice." He stepped out of the snug, leaving the woman to her untouched gin and her mounting regrets. He found Barney at the bar, still cleaning the same glass. "Barney, keep an eye on the lady. If anyone comes looking for her, tell them she's the minister's sister and she's prone to fainting spells." Barney gave a sharp nod, his formidable eyebrows twitching in silent agreement. Hamish stepped back out into the street, lugs immediately falling into line. The plan was already forming in his mind, a simple, low-tech trap that relied on the arrogance of a killer who thought they were far cleverer than a village policeman. He needed to move fast. Blair would be processing old Angus soon, and once the farmer was officially charged, the real murderer would vanish into the mist of the morning bus. Hamish didn't head for the station. Instead, he made his way toward the general store, his ambling gait hiding a purposeful urgency. He ducked inside and made a quick purchase, a small, cheap plastic USB drive and a tube of industrial-strength adhesive. He returned to the Tommel Castle Hotel, not through the front entrance, but via the kitchen gardens where the tragedy had unfolded. The forensics tape flapped mournfully in the wind. Hamish found a discarded mud-caked shoe near the edge of the Locher common work boot lost by a local weeks ago. He sat on a stone wall, meticulously glued the plastic drive to the inside of the heel, and then began to loudly whistle a cheerful, off-key tune. He knew the killer would be watching from one of the hotel windows, anxious to know if the leverage they had stolen was the only copy. He made a show of discovering the boot, turning it over in his hands with an expression of exaggerated triumph. He then tucked it under his arm and began to walk back toward the village, making sure to stop and confide in the hotel's gardener, a man known to be the biggest gossip in the county. "A grand find, Callum," Hamish shouted over the wind. "The missing evidence. I'll just be taking this to the old boat shed to dry it out before I call the chief. It's got the secret inside." Right enough. He saw a curtain twitch in a second-floor suite. The hook was baited. Now, he just had to wait in the cold, dark silence of the boat shed for the fish to bite. The boat shed sat on the very edge of the loch, a rickety structure of salt-bleached timber that groaned under the weight of the rising wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old tar, damp nets, and the cold metallic tang of the water lapping beneath the floorboards. Hamish sat in the shadows behind an overturned dory, his long frame folded uncomfortably into the darkness. Lugs were pressed against his side, the dog's warmth the only comfort in the freezing gloom. Hamish held the mud-caked workboot loosely in his lap, the fake USB drive glinting dully in the sliver of grey light filtering through a cracked window. He didn't have to wait long. The heavy door of the shed creaked open, admitting a swirl of mist and the sound of gravel crunching under a precise, expensive step. A figure silhouetted against the pale light of the loch stepped inside, pausing to let their eyes adjust to the darkness. It was not the woman in the silk mackintosh, nor was it a local farmer. It was a man in a dark, charcoal overcoat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the Highland breeze. It was Mr. Forbes, the quiet legal consultant, who had arrived at the hotel a day before Fotheringham, supposedly to handle the mundane paperwork of the land deal. He held a small, nickel-plated revolver with the practiced ease of a man who viewed violence as just another line item in a contract. "You can come out now, Macbeth," Forbes said, his voice as smooth and cold as a polished headstone. "I saw your little performance in the garden. It was remarkably ham-fisted, even for a village policeman. Give me the boot, and perhaps I'll let you go back to your poaching." Hamish stood up slowly, his height making him a formidable shadow in the cramped shed. He kept the boot in one hand, his expression one of vacant, wide-eyed surprise. "Mr. Forbes." "You gave me a fright, so you did," Hamish drawled, his Highland accent becoming thicker and more sluggish. "I was just drying this out for the chief. He's very keen on evidence, is DCI Blair. Though I'm thinking he might be confused why a London lawyer is waving a gun at a poor bobby over a bit of old leather." Forbes stepped closer, the revolver's barrel levelled at Hamish's chest. "We both know what's in that heel. Reginald was a fool to think he could blackmail the board. He thought he was the architect of this deal, but he was merely a loud, disposable distraction. Now, the drive. I won't ask again." Hamish took a step back, his heel catching on a coil of rope. "Is that what happened to Mr. Fotheringham? He wouldn't give you the drive, so you gave him a shove into the cabbages?" Forbes' lip curled in a sneer of pure arrogance. "Reginald was clumsy. He tripped. I merely assisted his descent into the water once I realized Head hidden the hardware wallet in his shoe. But I only found one drive in the loafer I took. Your little announcement to the gardener suggested there was a second backup. I'll have it now." Hamish looked down at the boot, then back at Forbes, a slow, deceptive smile spreading across his face. "Aye, well, there's a lesson in that, Mr. Forbes. Never trust a Highlander when he's being loud. We're only truly dangerous when we're quiet." In one fluid motion, Hamish didn't reach for his baton. He swung the heavy, mud-filled workboot with surprising strength, catching Forbes across the wrist. The revolver clattered to the floorboards, sliding toward the gap above the water. Forbes let out a snarl of rage and lunged at Hamish, his polished exterior vanishing into a desperate, animalistic fury. He was shorter than Hamish, but built with the compact strength of a man who frequented expensive gyms. They crashed into a stack of lobster creels, the wicker snapping under their weight. Lugs began to bark frantically, snapping at Forbes' heels as the two men wrestled in the dirt and salt. Forbes reached for a heavy iron boathook leaning against the wall, but Hamish was faster. Despite his appearance of laziness, Hamish possessed the wiry, deceptive power of a man who spent his life climbing hills and hauling nets. He caught Forbes' arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him face first against the damp timber of the shed wall. "I think," Hamish panted, his voice now hard and crystalline, "that we've had enough of London business in Lochstub for one day." He reached into his pocket for his handcuffs, clicking them shut around Forbes' wrists, just as the shed door was kicked open a second time. DCI Blair stood there, framed by the mist, his face an incredible shade of beet red, followed by a confused-looking Jimmy Anderson. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, his eyes bulging at the scene. "What the devil is going on? I told you to stay away from my investigation." Hamish stepped back, wiping a smear of mud from his forehead and reverting instantly to his mask of simple-minded exhaustion. "Terribly sorry, sir. I was just showing Mr. Forbes the scenery when he tripped and fell into these handcuffs. It's a very dangerous shed, almost as dangerous as a rain barrel." DCI Blair stood in the centre of the sagging boat shed, his chest heaving like a bellows as he surveyed the scene. He looked at the restrained Mr. Forbes, then at the mud-caked workboot, and finally at Hamish, who was currently leaning against a stack of nets with an expression of profound weariness. Blair's purple face began to twitch, a sure sign that his brain was struggling to reconcile his earlier arrest of old Angus with the reality of a handcuffed London lawyer in a dark shed. Hamish knew this was the most dangerous moment of the day. If he appeared too clever, if he stood there and explained the intricacies of the hardware wallet and the blackmail plot, Blair would be forced to acknowledge Hamish's brilliance. That acknowledgement would lead to a glowing report, which would lead to a commendation, which would inevitably lead to Hamish being promoted and dragged away from his beloved Lockdub to some grey concrete police headquarters in a city full of noise and smog. "Macbeth," Blair barked, though the volume was slightly dampened by a flicker of uncertainty. "Explain yourself. Why have you assaulted this gentleman? I already have the killer in the cells." Old Angus practically confessed with his silence. Hamish let out a long, theatrical sigh and straightened his peaked cap, making sure it sat at a particularly jaunty, incompetent angle. He looked at Blair with wide, admiring eyes, a masterclass in deceptive humility. "Oh, sir, you've got it all wrong," Hamish drawled, his voice thick with a fake Highlands simplicity. "I wasn't assaulting him. I was protecting the evidence you so brilliantly deduced was missing. You remember, sir? You mentioned shoes in the garden. You said the killer would likely return for it. I was just sitting here, keeping it warm for you when Mr. Forbes came in and started acting all peculiar." Blair blinked, his small eyes narrowing. "I said that, did I?" Hamish nodded vigorously, ignoring the skeptical look Sergeant Anderson was throwing him from the doorway. "Aye, sir. You told me, Macbeth, that shoe is the key. Keep your eyes peeled while I go and rattle the locals." So I did, and sure enough, your instincts were right on the money. Mr. Forbes here came looking for it, and when I tried to hand it over to him so he could bring it to you, he got all violent. I think he was trying to steal your glory, sir. He probably realized you were onto the London connection and panicked. Forbes, being dragged to his feet by Anderson, let out a muffled curse. "This is preposterous." "This idiot tricked me into quiet, you," Blair roared, his confidence returning in a sudden massive surge. He puffed out his chest, the buttons on his overcoat straining. He looked at the mud-caked boot as if he had indeed predicted its significance all along. "Of course I knew!" "I was merely using the arrest of the farmer as a feint, Macbeth. A tactical diversion to flush out the real rat. And it worked perfectly." Blair turned to Anderson, his voice booming with newfound authority. "Anderson, get this man into the van, and seize that boot. It's vital evidence in my corruption investigation. I've suspected this London firm was rotten from the moment I saw that yellow jacket." Hamish watched with internal relief as Blair began to bark orders, taking full command of the trap Hamish had actually set. "Shall I bring Penelope Vance to the station for you, sir?" Hamish asked softly, almost as an afterthought. "The witness you were undoubtedly planning to interview next?" Blair paused, his face momentarily blank before he recovered. "Yes, exactly. Bring her along. I'll handle the interrogation myself. You've done your bit, Macbeth. Try not to lose your trousers on the way home." As the police caravan began to roar away from the lock side, leaving a trail of exhaust and gravel in its wake, Hamish stood alone on the pier with lugs. He had successfully handed over a career-making case on a silver platter, ensuring that Blair would be the one receiving the accolades in the Strathbane papers. The DCI would be a hero, the London firm would be dismantled, and old Angus would be back in his cottage by nightfall, grumbling about the state of his flower beds. Most importantly, Hamish Macbeth would remain a lowly constable in a quiet village where he could poach the occasional salmon in peace. He patted his pocket, feeling the small, cheap USB drive he had purchased earlier. The real secrets were gone with Forbes, but Lockdub's peace had been preserved. The chaos of sirens and shouting eventually faded into the distance, leaving Lockdub to the cold, dignified silence of the Highland afternoon. The fog had surrendered to a crisp, biting clarity that sharpened the edges of the mountains against a pale violet sky. Hamish walked slowly back toward the village, his hands deep in his pockets and his shoulders hunched against the wind. Lugs trotted ahead, pausing occasionally to sniff at a frost-covered tuft of grass, seemingly as relieved as his master that the tourists had been cleared out. By the time Hamish reached his small police station, the light was beginning to fail, casting long blue shadows over the loch. He didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he made a detour to old Angus cottage. He found the farmer sitting on his stone porch, looking bewildered but unharmed, clutching a fresh bottle of malt whiskey that had mysteriously appeared on his doorstep 5 minutes after his release. "They let me go, Hamish," Angus grumbled, though his eyes were wet. "That purple-faced man just shouted that I was too stupid to be a criminal and told me to get out of his sight. He didn't even apologize for the kale. "Aye, well, Blair's a busy man, Angus," Hamish said with a small, knowing smile. "He's off to be a hero in the papers. I'd stay clear of the hotel for a few days if I were you. The air is a bit thin up there." Returning to his own quarters, Hamish finally shed his damp uniform tunic and hung his peaked cap on the peg. The station was quiet, the telephone blissfully silent. He set a match to the peat in the stove, watching the orange glow take hold and fill the room with that ancient, earthy scent that meant home. He filled his old kettle and set it on the heat, then moved to the larder. He had a fine piece of venison gifted by a local who preferred not to mention where it came from and a few firm potatoes. As the stew began to simmer and the kettle whistled, Hamish sat at his scarred wooden table with a fresh pot of coffee. He thought briefly of Penelope Vance, who was likely currently being rescued by Blair's ego, and of Mr. Forbes, who would soon discover that the Scottish legal system was significantly less polite than a London boardroom. The hardware wallet was in Blair's evidence locker now, but Hamish knew the real victory wasn't the arrest or the scandal. It was the fact that the loch was still quiet, the village was still theirs, and no luxury marina would be churning up the water any time soon. He poured himself a mug of the thick, black coffee and leaned back, his long legs stretching toward the warmth of the stove. The lazy policeman was back in his element. He had manipulated the world just enough to keep it from changing, and he had done it all while looking like head barely woken up. "Well, lugs," Hamish murmured, as the dog settled onto the rug with a satisfied groan. "The hymns have ended, the Sassenachs have gone, and I believe there's just enough stew for the two of us. It's a grand life, if you don't let the work get in the way of it." He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl against the chimney, perfectly content to be exactly where he was, the smartest man in the Highlands, with absolutely no one the wiser.